Hi everyone, you may have wondered how literate were the ancient Celts? Now a lot of people think of the Celts as just savages or primitive barbarians who didn't have any written language, didn't write any documents down. But is that really true? Well, I've talked in a previous video about the fact that the Celts were not primitive barbarians at all. But what about specifically their use of writing? Did they use writing at all, or were they illiterate? Well, let's take a look at the evidence. So just to mention at the start, because I know that this can be a little bit of a controversial topic, when I say Celts, I'm referring to the Celtic-speaking nations of primarily Gaul and Iberia and Ireland and Britain. So I'm defining Celts as being those who spoke a Celtic language. So yes, I'm including the Britons in that. I know other people have other definitions and that's fine. This isn't the video for that topic. So taking that broad view of the Celts, how literate were the Celts? Well, the first trace of Celtic writing, the first definitive trace of Celtic writing, comes from the area of Gaul just north of Italy. So in this area, in the 6th century BCE, there was a tribe, a Celtic tribe, known as the Lepontii. Now the Lepontii spoke Lepontic, which was a P-Celtic language. P-Celtic is one of the divisions of the Celtic languages. There are a few different ways of dividing the Celtic languages, but one common way is to divide it between P-Celtic and Q-Celtic. So just to illustrate, Welsh is a P-Celtic language and Irish is a Q-Celtic language. You'll notice that the Irish word for head is essentially the same as the Welsh word for head, but it has a C instead of a P. So it starts with a K sound instead of the P sound from Welsh. So that's why Welsh is a P-Celtic language while Irish is a Q-Celtic language. So that's a basic division. Now, Lepontic was a P-Celtic language, as was Gaulish as a whole. Now, the Lepontii, just north of Italy, they adopted the Etruscan alphabet in the 6th century, and they started using the Etruscan alphabet to write inscriptions in their own language. Similar to how the Etruscans themselves had previously adopted the Greek alphabet to write in their own language Etruscan. So it's the same principle involved here. So the Celts of Gaul, southern Gaul, they adopted Etruscan and started writing in their own language, in Lepontic. And so we see many inscriptions in the 6th century in that area. However, for whatever reason, the rest of the Celts, the rest of the Gauls, didn't follow suit. We don't know why, but they didn't. So we don't see any inscriptions from other Celtic groups until centuries later. Particularly from the 1st century BCE through to the 2nd century CE, we see lots of Gallic inscriptions. But even before then, as early as the 3rd century BCE, we do see some inscriptions among the other Gallic tribes. However, they didn't primarily use the Etruscan alphabet, although there are some examples of inscriptions from these other Gallic tribes using the Etruscan alphabet. But primarily, they used the Greek alphabet. And we actually see some examples of writing on coins as early as the 3rd century BCE using Greek characters and also some Greek motifs as well on the coins. So it seems that in this period, the 3rd century BCE, the Celts were rather interested in the Greek world, and so they were adopting some elements of their culture and trying to emulate it. Very, very simple. Obviously, you can't put much on a coin, can you? But the point is, that's what we find primarily in the early evidence. We find Celtic tribes in Gaul using Greek characters from the 3rd century BCE onwards, mainly on coins. But then we do, as I said, find from the 3rd century BCE onwards, we find a greater concentration of Gallic inscriptions. And at that point, they start writing on more things than just little coins. They start writing on monuments made of stone and also on tablets as well. And some of these, although most of them are very brief inscriptions, but some of them are quite large. One of them in particular has about 150 words on it, so it's a lengthy inscription. So the Celts definitely were capable of writing. They weren't an illiterate society. We also see this from the words of Julius Caesar. So Caesar, in his Gallic Wars, he describes the Celts of Gaul and the Britons as well and he describes, in reference to the Celts of Gaul, the following. In the camp of the Helvetii, which was a Celtic tribe in Gaul, lists were found, drawn up in Greek characters, and were brought to Caesar, in which an estimate had been drawn up, name by name, of the number who had gone forth from their country who were able to bear arms, and likewise the number of boys, old men, and women separately. So the Gallic Celts definitely were capable of writing. They used Greek characters most of the time, sometimes Etruscan characters, but mostly Greek characters. We see here from Caesar's testimony here that they were capable of producing rather large inscriptions and writings. I mean, it's unlikely that this list that he's talking about here, these lists, were written on monuments or large tablets, obviously. It's evident that these lists were written probably on perishable materials. So they were clearly capable of writing, and we also see this in reference to the Druids. Speaking about the Druids, who were the religious leaders of the Celts, Caesar says, "Nor do they regard it lawful to commit these being certain sacred matters, to writing, though in almost all other matters, in their public and private transactions, they use Greek characters." So again, we see that the Celts of Gaul were perfectly capable of writing. They used Greek characters mainly. They apparently didn't put to writing their sacred matters, well, particularly the Druids, but in public and private transactions, they wrote using Greek characters, which indicates that writing was something that was used in the private and public life of the Celts. So evidently they were clearly a literate society. And then what about the Celts of Britain, or just the Britons if you prefer? Well, sometimes that quote that I just read is used as evidence for writing in Britain. But an objection to that concept is the fact that, as I explained, he was talking about the Druids in Gaul. That passage comes in his description of the Gauls, not his description of Britain. So, some people have said, no, this can't be used as evidence that writing was known in Britain. But regarding the Druids, notice what Caesar says here. It is believed that their rule of life was discovered in Britain and transferred thence to Gaul, and today those who would study the subject more accurately journey as a rule to Britain to learn it. So according to Caesar, the Druids generally went to Britain to study to be Druids. So if the Druids were familiar with writing, and they used it in their public and private lives, and they studied in Britain, surely writing was known in Britain as well. Surely it strains credibility to believe that writing was something that was a part of life among the Celts in Gaul, including among the Druids, and yet the Druids were trained in Britain but didn't know how to write there. Writing wasn't a thing. That doesn't make any sense to me. I think that this, well, when we put these two pieces of evidence together, it's very likely that writing was indeed known in Britain. However, we don't just need to rely on Caesar's words, because once again we have the evidence from coins. We see that on coins in ancient Britain, they did write, again, often using Greek characters, however, mainly Latin characters in the case of the Britons. But in any case, whether they were using Latin characters or Greek characters, the point is they were writing. They wrote the names of their kings on the coins, and also, just like in Gaul, sometimes the word for king, sometimes they even wrote in Latin, like Cunobellinus, for example. He included the Latin word for king, rex, on some of his coins. So the Britons, just like the Gauls, were capable of writing. They were familiar with the custom, they were able to do it, they were not an illiterate society, although it does appear that they wrote less than the Gauls. There's almost no evidence of writing outside of the custom of writing on coins among the Britons. So it does suggest that they were a far less literate society than the Gauls, unless maybe they only had the custom of writing on perishable materials. That's perfectly possible. So it could be that writing in Britain was just as common as it was in Gaul, but if they wrote on perishable materials, we have no way of knowing that, and we just have these hints from Caesar's words and the traces on coins. But it's interesting, one of the rare examples of writing outside of on coins is from the Bath Curse tablets. So the Bath curse tablets date to the Roman period, and they were found, of course, in Bath. And there are lots of these curse tablets. Most of them are written in Latin, in the Latin script, specifically Roman cursive, which is a very different looking version of the Roman script. If you were to just see an inscription of it, well, you can see now on the screen, you wouldn't think that's the Latin alphabet. But it's a version of it, it's something the Romans used, it's called Roman cursive, and this was used very commonly in Britain and Gaul. And in Britain, on the Bath curse tablets, there are 2 tablets which appear to be written in Brythonic, which is the ancestor language of Welsh and Cornish and Breton. So this appears to be, so far, the only known example of a notable Brythonic inscription outside of just the few words that are found on coins. The only substantial inscription written in Brythonic before the medieval era. Now again, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Britons didn't commonly write in their own language, but it does suggest that if they did, they evidently did it primarily on perishable materials. So in conclusion, what can we say about the literacy of the Celts? Well, speaking primarily about the Celts of Gaul and the Britons, we can see that they were not an illiterate society. They could write, they were literate. They wrote with Etruscan characters and Greek characters, and also later with Latin characters. And although Celtic Britain doesn't seem to have been as literate a society as Celtic Gaul, writing was still known there. Now here's another question for you. Speaking of ancient alphabets, has an ancient alphabet in the Sinai Peninsula proved the events of the Exodus? Well, come back next time for my next video to see the answer to that.